Hi, I would like to welcome you all to today's translation seminar. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Michaela Albl-Mikasa. Professor Albl-Mikasa is widely considered the expert on the topic of English as a lingua franca in the field of translation and interpreting studies. So we're very excited that she will share her research on this topic today in this translation seminar. I just talked to her and I told her that she gave her talk a very intriguing topic. You know, the word she chose, the topic of her talk is the imaginary invalid, interpreters in times of English as a lingua franca. The words she chose, such as imaginary and invalid, seem to carry much of the message that Professor Albl-Mikasa is going to convey today. And the content of her abstract is equally intriguing. She describes how interpreters often feel about English as a lingua franca, or even how we behave. But what does research tell us? Does it support our observations or experience, or does it otherwise? So this is what we can find out from her talk today. Professor Albl-Mikasa is Professor of Interpreting Studies at Zurich University of Applied Sciences. She is currently the principal investigator of a big project, a 4-year-long project on cognition load in interpreting and translation, which is supported by the Swiss National Science Foundation. Aside from English as a lingua franca, Professor Albl-Mikasa is also known for her research on consecutive interpreting and research on cognitive load. And her research covers both conference interpreting and community interpreting, including public service interpreting and medical interpreting. Professor Albl-Mikasa has published many articles, and one of her most recent publications is the Routledge Handbook of Conference Interpreting, which she co-edited with Professor Elizabeth Tiselius. While talking about this handbook, there will soon be a book review on this handbook to be published in the Journal of Interpreting, written by another heavyweight in our field, Professor Robin Sutton. And please allow me to just read a couple of sentences from that review, which many of you are going to read because it's going to be published online first very soon. And here I quote, "It is certainly the most complete guide to the world of conference interpreting. The volume is indeed a state-of-the-art compilation that will more than complement a spate of recent compendia from both Benjamin's and Routledge." And we're talking about edited volumes such as the Routledge Encyclopedia of Interpreting Studies, edited by Professor Franz Peschaker. So we're very excited about her talk, and also about the publication of her handbook that she co-edited with Professor Tiselius. I think from these sentences you get a clear sense of how this handbook will be viewed in the field of interpreting. And without further ado, I'll bring you Professor Albl-Mikasa.
Thank you very much, Minhua, for this very generous introduction and for your invitation. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to listen to my talk today. This online talk, bringing together people from different parts of the world, would, of course, not be possible without two major developments. One is the advance in distance communication technology, and one is the spread of global English. Otherwise, we would not have a shared language. And these two developments are not only at the root of globalization, they are very much impacting interpreting. And this is why, which takes me right into my topic. And I'll be sharing my slides with you. And if Esther, you could please let me know whether this works.
Language of their choice.
Yes. Is that good to see
yes.
everyone?
Yes, Michaela, we can see it, and we just heard a short clip. We could hear that too.
Right, very good. Okay, so as I said, there are these two developments which are impacting interpreting, and Jones in an AIC study, you know, AIC is the International Association of Conference Interpreters, mentions the new technologies in remote interpreting, etc., and the increasing use of international English as two of the main obstacles for the interpreting profession. And then there is Donovan from the OECD, who says that the predominance of English in conferences and of course in the world at large is probably the single most significant issue for interpreting today. And against this background, it takes us a little bit by surprise that we find that a lot of scholarly attention has been given to new technologies, to remote interpreting even prior to the pandemic. And very little attention has actually gone into the impact of the global spread of English on the interpreting profession. And you may be wondering why this has become a main area of research for me. And it started off at the Heidelberg University, where I did my degree in conference interpreting. And after which I got involved in an EU project, which was meant to lead on to a PhD. And then my supervisor shifted to the University of Tübingen, which is also in the south of Germany. And there was no Institute of Translation and Interpreting. There was no interpreting. We were in the English department. There was second language acquisition. There was applied English linguistics. There was English teacher training, but no interpreting, no translation. So I landed up in the Tübingen English as a Lingua Franca research group, because at that time and even now, English as a Lingua Franca is researched in English departments. This was a group which set up, which collected data for the Tübingen English as a Lingua Franca corpus, and our seminars were all on English as a Lingua Franca. We went to the conferences and we mixed with the community, etc. I still did my PhD in interpreting studies, and after finishing the PhD, I had an opportunity to come to Zurich University of Applied Sciences and back into interpreting studies. When I came to the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, I realized that the interpreters there, they were actually speaking in very different terms about ELF than what I had experienced in Tübingen. In fact, it was in stark contrast. They were actually having a very critical, very skeptical, rather negative view of English as a lingua franca, whereas the ELF community, the mainstream ELF research, had a very positive view on ELF. For them, it was a successful means of communication, and it was all about, emancipating the majority of the non-native ELF speakers in the world from the golden standard of native English. So a stark contrast here, and the natural thing to do was then to combine the two, my English as a lingua franca background and my interpreting studies background, and to look at the impact of English as a lingua franca on interpreting and translation, which has grown into a subfield, which I call ITELF, Interpreting, Translation, and English as a Lingua Franca. And it has then led on to the CLIN project, which Professor Liu just mentioned, and which I will be reporting on a little bit later on. So the situation against which we are trying to look at this phenomenon is that English is the first global lingua franca. There have always been many lingua francas. There has been Aramaic, Latin, French, the diplomatic language of the 19th century, but this is the first global one. And English is the #1 conference language, and this being a global lingua franca, you have at conferences nowadays many more non-native speakers of English than native ones. English non-native speakers outnumber native speakers all over the world to a great degree. Estimates say that there is a ratio of 1 to 4, roughly speaking. But interpreters and translators are still trained for native language. I would like to give you an idea of what the view is of English as a lingua franca. This is Alison Graves. She is a senior interpreting official at the European Parliament. And in my view, this sums up beautifully how interpreters view English as a lingua franca.
So the Council Regulation number 1 is the one which regulates language use, and it's obviously not the interpretation services which decide which languages will be official languages and which won't. Obviously not. We are just service providers. The language provision is a very political question. And members can speak the official language of their choice. And that's quite an interesting wording. It doesn't say members will speak the official language of their country or the official language of their birth. It says they speak the official language of their choice. And so that means that not all members do speak their own language. Some members prefer to speak in what they fondly imagine is English. Some members speak their foreign languages extremely well. But I hope, yes, well anyway, a lot of them don't speak it as well as they think they do. And what happens then is there is somebody speaking in imperfect English. And a lot of the listeners are listening imperfectly because they don't understand English perfectly either. And so there's this huge mismatch between the message that is intended and the message that is received. And part of our job is to persuade the members that they can leave it to us, they can leave it to the professionals, and we will transmit their message in the way they intended it. We can make them sound really good. And that's a lot of our job, is persuading them to trust us, to have confidence in the interpretation services. And that's why it's so important that our quality is of the highest possible level, because it's very easy to lose the confidence of the members. We have to provide excellent service at all times, or they won't want it. The official language that's often chosen, we used to call it BSE, which was badly spoken English. But now I've heard someone refer to it as Desperanto, and I quite like that. So that is actually going to be the 25th official language of the European Union. Why we're so hot on this is because for interpreters, it's a joy to get a speaker speaking their own language, to listen to someone speaking really beautiful German, and to be able to interpret that is a joy. To listen to someone struggling with a language that they're not really totally confident in makes our job very difficult as well, because you've then got to decipher what is it they're trying to say. So we really are keen on members speaking their own language. And if you've listened to somebody like Martin Schulz, who is an amazing German speaker, absolutely amazing, and he is a joy to interpret. He's a huge challenge, and it is a little bit like riding a roller coaster, because he is so quick and so clever, and he can change register like nobody I've ever heard speak. And one minute he's very high flown and talking about the Congress of Vienna, and the next minute he's being extremely vulgar, because he does like to use colourful expressions, all in the same sentence, and he's like this all the time. And for an interpreter to keep up with that is an amazing challenge and a great ride to be on. So that's why we'd always prefer members to speak their own language, if at all possible, because it makes our job easier and it makes them sound better.
Okay, so from this you can, I think, gather quite a bit the interpreter's view on English as a lingua franca. It means that they are hot on it, as Alison Graves said. It really is an issue that is of concern for them, and they do prefer native speakers for the reasons given. This critical attitude, I've met with this critical attitude quite a bit. And indeed, interpreters do not speak about ELF. Interpreters speak about, as you heard, badly spoken English, BSE, about Globish, or even about Des Esperanto. So of course, we would like to know a little bit more. What are the reasons of interpreters to have this critical attitude? Do they have good reasons, or are they just complaining for no good reasons? So the questions we want to be looking at are, what is ELF? What are the potential challenges involved? And what is the actual evidence that there are challenges and that they do have reasons to be so skeptical about the phenomenon? What is ELF? ELF is not a language. ELF is not a variety of English. ELF is a mode of communication in international encounters where different English speakers come together. And Kachro has illustrated in the form of his early 3-circle model, whereby he says there are English as a native language from the inner circle, from countries such as the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. There are English as a second language speakers from the so-called outer circle. These are speakers from countries such as India, Nigeria, etc., where English is still an official second language due to a colonial past. Then there are English speakers from the expanding circle, where English is a foreign language which you would learn at the age of 10 at school, and which you wouldn't really be confronted with for administrative, official, or other purposes. And all of these speakers come together in the most varied constellations for international communication, and try to use the resources that they have got. And this is ELF. Those scenarios where these different speakers come together to use language as the one language that they share. So against this background, we have a situation where people come together from very different backgrounds, and Barbara Seidelhofer describes this in the following words. She is a scholar from the University of Vienna in Austria. She is one of the main ELF researchers, together with Anna Mauranen from the University of Helsinki in Finland, or Jennifer Jenkins from the University of Southampton in England. And she says it's a sociolinguistic commonplace that all natural languages are variable, continually in flux, complex, and endlessly emergent. But English, as a global means of communication that it has become over recent decades, is a special case altogether. As a truly postmodern phenomenon, it is used by speakers from all walks of life, in all continents, with hundreds of different first languages and varying degrees of proficiency, and in a way that demonstrates very clearly that communicative effectiveness is frequently a function of variability and the destabilization of established linguistic norms. So you can see, coming from these various backgrounds, speakers are found to soft assemble their multilingual resources and to adapt and appropriate them to meet contextual demands and the requirements of the moment. So they can't pick and choose, they can only pick. They pick from the various resources that they have available, whatever they have got, and put it together, assemble it in order to make themselves understood. In the process, they will come up with innovative patterns and non-conformist variants, Mauranen describes the approximations as one of the most typical phenomenon of ELF, and she gives the following example. So you would have idiomatic English collocations like to put an end to, and then ELF speakers, knowing that there is such an expression, they would know the meaning of it, they would know the usage conventions, when to use it, how to use it, but they wouldn't be quite sure about the exact structural form. So they would end up with an expression such as, for instance, to put the end on. So these approximations you find a lot in ELF communication. This is based on her corpus studies. And so ELF is described as an open source phenomenon where people just pick whatever resources they've got available. And of course, due to the varied backgrounds, it is characterized by variability, hybridity, and ad hoc constructions which you use to make yourself understood in these particular situations. Now, the interesting point is that interpreters have also described this concept of assemblage, or this notion of assemblage, or this observation of people picking their resources and assembling it. And to go back to Jones again, he speaks of Lego English. He says ELF speakers take some basic building blocks, buzzwords, jargon, the appropriate technical terminology, then link them with various connecting phrases to try to build concepts and produce a result which is as close to real English as a child's Lego house is to the buildings we live in. My experience is also that this problem gets worse as the day wears on and delegates tire. And he gives us an example of this, of what he calls Lego English. And he says, our objective is that the stakeholders in the consultation all take the platform not only from the representative angle, but are also implicated in the overall policy objective. So you can see here that this is a typical conference sentence. At first impression, it sounds all good, grammar, syntax, all fine, lexical expressions seem to be appropriate to the situation. But when you give it a second glance, you will see that it's very difficult to work out what exactly is being meant, what the speaker means to say and wants to get across. And this is this idea of the soft assemblage of the Lego English of ELF speakers putting whatever resources they have together, but not quite being able to make their point in a precise way. And that obviously can make it difficult for interpreters. So how is ELF characterized? ELF is multilingual. It is an English that comes into contact with virtually the entire range of human languages in ad hoc constituted globalized networks. It is second order contact of hybrid similects with other hybrid similects. That is to say, speakers from a certain region, like say from a German speaking region, they would speak English in a particular way, and people from some Asian country would speak English in a particular way. So they would develop a similect, which is hybrid by nature, because the speakers don't learn their language or their English in a speech community which is in a certain way regulates itself. So you have hybrid similects meeting in with hybrid similects in ELF situations, and as Mauranen points out, this adds a lot to the complexity of the communication. She speaks of the variety and unpredictability of language parameters, interlocutors' accents, transfer features, and proficiency levels. Now, accents are not the issue. They are an issue in ELF communication, but they are an issue always with interpreters, because also with native speakers, you will find that that accents are an issue. Say you have an Australian, a Texan, a Scottish speaker, that can be quite tricky accent-wise. And the same happens in ELF communication, where you get a lot of accents from people coming from all over the world. Now, transfer features are more of a typical ELF phenomenon, of a typical ELF feature. So ELF speakers will speak an English that is cross-linguistically influenced by their first language. And this is a natural phenomenon. And from bilingualism research, we know that L1 transfer is inversely proportional to language proficiency, which is quite natural, because the lower your command of a language, the more you have to rely on your first language, the more you have to kind of literally translate into your foreign language, into your English, and the more your English will show the features of your first language. And this will bring out the transcoding of idiomatic phrases and collocational patterns, of course, because you might not know the idiomatic phrase in English, and then you will transcode it from your L1. And I mean, anecdotes among interpreters abound. They are sometimes funny, amusing, sometimes a little embarrassing. One interpreter told us that you will find moderators, for instance, who want to say to the speakers, be brief and concise. Now, concise in German is prägnant. Prägnant is very close to pregnant. It's a kind of false friend. So the moderator ended up saying, be brief and pregnant. Obviously, this is not quite the way of putting it. And it's also a way that not everybody will understand unless you are a German and you understand what is behind it, what is the underlying structure. There are many more examples. I've heard interpreters speak about a really embarrassing one to voice their annoyance, which they sometimes have. Since this is recorded and I don't want to be quoted on the example, I'd rather relate it when the recording is switched off, but I can tell you it can get rather embarrassing. To give you perhaps an example from an authentic conference, this is the German English speaker said escaped profits, from literally translated from entgangene Gewinne, and what it meant and what a native speaker would have said is loss in profit, lost profits. Now, or the second one, offer the suitable achievement extends furthermore. A native version would have been still offer the services they need or something along those lines. Now you can see that unless you have German as one of your working languages, you will find it very hard to recover the underlying structure or to know what it means. What it means to say, when a speaker says offer the suitable achievement extends furthermore. So if you're an interpreter who say interprets from English into Spanish or French, but does not have German as a language, it can become pretty difficult to really get at what the speaker is trying to get across. So I've called this the shared languages benefit. So if you know the languages, the L1, the first language of the English speaker, it will help a lot in understanding what is being said. And interestingly, as part of the CLIN project, we have just received the responses of an international survey, which we have conducted. And there are some 600 translators, almost 600 translators responding, and then the response rate for the interpreters was some 300 plus. And without this being prompted, without being asked for it, just being asked about how they cope and deal with non-native input, the shared languages benefit, not using this label, but describing it was mentioned quite a substantial number of times as one of the strategies in dealing with ELF. So it is something that interpreters really do use. So ELF is multilingual. ELF also lacks shared norms. There's no mutual knowledge of conventionalized norms. As you know, common ground, the construction of a plausible mental representation of the source text world is the very basis of prediction and of generating top-down expectations, which in turn is fundamental to language processing in general and to interpreting in particular. So if you are in an interactive situation, you can compensate for it through communicative strategies, negotiation of meaning, pragmatic adaptation. But if, as a conference interpreter, you are in a monological situation, this is not possible. There's also in the ELF literature, they always speak about the let it pass principle or strategy, whereby you just wait a little, hoping that the meaning which you haven't quite understood will become clearer later on in the discourse. But this is not an option for the interpreters. So interpreters have to normalize, pre-edit the source input, tidy it up mentally, in order to be able to then render it. And yeah, it's plausible to assume that this involves some additional effort in the comprehension phase. So ELF is multilingual, ELF lacks shared norms, ELF is intercultural, and more so because globalization acts as an amplifier of social, cultural, and linguistic diversity, bringing together people with very different backgrounds, resources, and communicative scripts, destabilizing assumptions of common ground. Patchwork lingua-cultural backgrounds lead to a widening of culture-related gaps, interculturally mixed communicative conventions, and pragmatic hybridity. So this just goes to show just how multifarious ELF is, and interpreters, they lose out on a major contextual determinant for sense making, because normally the input they would get, they would kind of relate it to an L1 cultural background, a British, American, or Australian one, the one they have learned, the one they have familiarized themselves with. But this is not possible here because they can't relate it to a cultural background with which they are not familiar. So again, in monological settings, this is particularly urgent or tricky, because culturally based frames of reference cannot be negotiated. So I hope I have given you an idea of the multifaceted nature of ELF. If you are interested to know more about ELF, I would like to refer you to the Routledge Handbook of English as a Lingua Franca. It covers a very wide range of topics relating to ELF. Yeah, it really gives you insights into everything concerning ELF. And here I want to give you a very short and brief example of what it looks like in practice when ELF speakers come together and against the background of their multicultural, multilingual backgrounds. This is an ELF conference in the ASEAN context. There were speakers from Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam. There were also American native speakers. There were expanding circle speakers like myself from a German-Swiss background. So it was really truly an ELF conference. And then showing one speaker, you can see what it can mean if if ELF aspects or facets come together. So you would have a difficult accent, maybe you would have concepts used which are not quite, if you are not quite familiar with against your cultural background, there would be a certain proficiency level involved, etc. Just to give you an idea what ELF speaking can be like in the real world.
You've on it, yes. For example, like I saw an example like the product called seaweed. You know, seaweed, we always like, it's like a snack. Seaweed. But it cannot sell well in UK. It's weed. No one gonna eat weed. So it changed the name to the sea vegetable. Sound better, right? Sea vegetable. Instead of seaweed. They changed the translation to sea vegetable. Yeah. So I think we really need the choice of language, and also in terms of trade. When we translate from another language from Thai language to another language, probably the product is not eatable. Yeah. So you have to consider the rule and the language's rule and terminology.
Can I have my slides?
So we showed this clip or extract from this conference to our students, yeah, they were really getting a little bit worried about, the real ELF interpreting world out there, and having to do such speeches in their practical interpreting assignments one day. So what we are doing against this background, I mean, not obviously, this is one example where many aspects come together. As Alison Graves said, there are many English speakers, many foreign language speakers, which speak at a very high level. And then every speaker is different. You have people which you understand well, others you don't understand so well. There are good speakers and not so good speakers in native languages as well, etc., etc. But I'm just trying to bring home to you how all the various aspects that feed into ELF communication and then that can make it difficult or challenging for interpreters. And against this background, at my university, we have set up specialized ELF classes running over 2 semesters, where we introduce interpreter trainees into everything that is related to ELF. So we have a co-teaching scheme whereby we have a practical trainer and SCIC interpreter. And then there's myself coming from the more theoretical side of things, and we give inputs, theoretical as well as practical inputs. They go to the booth, they interpret various speeches from different regions of the world, ELF speeches. We discuss them, we comment on it, etc. So they get a lot of input and insights and background regarding ELF. So once they are out there in the real interpreting world, they are prepared for it. And this trainer that we are having the class, that I'm having the class with, he says, he's a practicing interpreter himself, and he says the majority of English speakers that he now gets to interpret are actually non-native speakers, and his hypothesis is that 70% of what an ELF speaker wants to say can he express in comprehensible English. And 70% of what an ELF speaker says is actually understood by the ELF listener. So he comes up with a somewhat provocative assumption that less than half of the originally intended message is transmitted. And this is exactly what Alison Graves said when she said, speakers speak in imperfect English, listeners listen imperfectly. So there is this huge mismatch between message intended and message received. And now you can imagine that an organizer of a conference or of some kind of communicative event wants the main part of it, or the main goal and purpose of it, is that people understand each other and get whatever needs to be negotiated done. Now, to do this on the basis of communication, where less than half or maybe just half or a little bit more is transmitted, is not ideal. And I think this is a good argument also for clients of interpreters, that they know they should think twice before they think everything can be done in English alone. So our aim at those classes is to try and make sure that interpreting students are enabled to deliver at least the full incoming 70%, and perhaps ideally more. That is the big question. The question is, should interpreters do better than the source speaker, than the source input? Should they improve on that input? That is one of the questions that is sometimes raised. So to sum up, ELF as it impacts interpreters, the main ELF-induced problem triggers are transfer from the first language of the speakers, various proficiency levels, the issue of logic of coherence, that many ELF speakers are not quite capable of exactly making their point and getting across what they want to say. And then also text organization is a point. This is just a tiny little but interesting study as part of a master thesis, whereby a native speaker and two non-native speakers presented the products of their company on the basis of the same PowerPoint slides. And we could see that actually the native speaker textualized what he wanted to say in quite a different manner. So he would use a lot of rapport building phrases to address the audience, meta discourse comments to structure the text. So he would say, for instance, this was point 1, it takes us to point 2, this is interrelated with point 3. So structuring the text, giving away the development of the text or the speech, which obviously supports interpreter processing. This was not there on the part of the non-native speakers. They were kind of ticking off fact by fact, information by information, just to get it across as it was on the slides. And our assumption is that perhaps the non-native speakers just do not have the resources, neither the linguistic one nor the mental resources to do what the native speaker did. They are so busy concentrating on getting the information across in a foreign language that there are no resources left to just, to supply the embedding stuff, as it were. So as you can see, these are aspects and points that go way beyond accent, and therefore it is of relevance also for the translators, and the translators are indeed the translation team of the CLINT project, as you will see in a minute. The consequences of ELF variability are that ELF differs from what interpreters and translators know from language learning and specialist training, that the mismatches between the input and the multilingual resources they have built up and stored in their mental translation memory are quite pronounced. So the input does not quite match what they have learned and rehearsed and stored. And this may lead to retrieval difficulties, disrupted automatisms, halted processes, disturbed inferencing, and anticipation, which, as you know, are just the very fundamental processes in interpreting. So the assumption is interpreter complaints do have some justification. They are not only potential, but actual challenges, and they can possibly tax mental resources. And this is the background against which we started our research. We wanted to see what exactly it meant to have ELF input for the interpreters. So the point of departure is the fact that interpreting is an extreme case of intertextuality. That means the target text depends fully on the source text, or on, more precisely, on the mental representation built up by the interpreter over the source text. And Kalina says the quality of the interpretation is largely a function of the quality of the source text to be interpreted, and the interpretation cannot really be any better than the respective source text. So again, for the interpreters who have this self-perception, of wanting to deliver a really good performance and target speech, this will make it very difficult, because obviously ELF manifests in speaker output. This becomes an interpreter input, and this may impact interpreter processing and performance. Gilles says that it does indeed. He says strong accents and incorrect grammar and lexical usage are a problem trigger, increasing processing capacity requirements. And this is in line with Sweller's cognitive load theory. Sweller distinguishes between intrinsic and extraneous load, the intrinsic load referring to the task at hand. And so we can think that while extraneous load, the limited visual input, poor sound quality, etc., is critical to remote interpreting, intrinsic load or source speech difficulty is critical in ELF contexts. And against this background, our project looks into the effects of ELF on interpreter processing and performance, and whether or not additional load is involved. So it's, as Professor Liu has mentioned, it's a Synergia project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. CLINT is for cognitive load in interpreting and translation. And we received substantial funding for 3 teams. It is at my university, the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, the interpreting and translation teams. And at the Zurich University, the University of Zurich, it's the neuropsychology team. They do their experiments in their neuropsychology lab, and we did ours in the simulated workplace setting in our usability lab. The team of the neuropsychologists are Lutz Jenke, the head of the lab, then Stefan Elmer, a senior researcher, and then the doctoral students Michaela Boos and Matthias Kobi. Michael Boos worked on the spoken language tasks and Matthias Kobi on the written language tasks. And as you see, we have interpreting tasks. So written language and translation tasks, so the other way around. So translation tasks, written ELF and interpreting spoken. So this is actually a particularity of our project in ELF research. The focus has been on spoken language, on spoken ELF. There is very little research out there on written ELF. So there's the Vrelfa project in Helsinki at the University of Helsinki from Anna Mauranen. Other than that, there's hardly anything out there. And it's a novelty that we are looking at both together. So in the simulated workplace setting at our university, it's spoken ELF with the interpreters, written ELF with the translators, and the neuropsychologists, they have two tracks, spoken language tasks and written language tasks, which they look at in an EEG setting. As for our teams, we have the interpreting and the translation team. So our team is myself and Ann-Kathrin Gieshoff, who is the postdoc in the project and or in the team, and Romy Tommen is the research assistant. And then we have the translation studies team, Maureen Ernstberger-Dow, and then Andrea Hunziger-Heb, who is the postdoc in the team, and Romina Schaub-Torsello, who is the research assistant. What we are looking at is how does ELF affect interpreters, translators, and other multilinguals. So we have three participant groups: interpreters, translators, and multilinguals. And each group has, for each group, there are three levels of expertise: bachelor students, master students, and professionals. The professionals for the multilinguals are English teachers and English students. We use authentic material, which we gathered at a real life, or at two real life conferences. So we got the abstracts that were used there and the corresponding presentations or talks, which we video recorded from non-native speakers. And we applied, used a number of measures such as heart rate measurements, eye tracking, webcam and video recordings, and then self-report measures such as the SCIC for the for stress-related anxiety, the NASA workload index, which looks at workload, the TIQ, which looks at emotional intelligence, and the RVPs, retrospective commentaries, which they were asked to, which we recorded after the task. And then there was the international survey, which I have already mentioned. This is the simulated workplace setting at our university. So you have the translation track, the interpreting track, and the multilingual setup. For the interpreters, obviously, we had to give the BA students a side translation task because they couldn't do interpreting as yet. And for the multilinguals, they had a reading comprehension task for the written input and a listening comprehension task for the spoken input. And you can see here, ELF or EDE. EDE stands for Edited English, and this is another important part of our project. So we took the original authentic ELF material and we edited it to conform to native speaker norms. so that we had two versions of the same text, which we could then, the tasks of which, or the interpretations and translations of which we could then compare. Here it is in a little bit more detail. So part one, you have a warm-up phase, then you have picture description for a baseline, you have interpreting and translation of text one, and then you have the questionnaires, and then you have a break, part two, picture description, interpreting, translation of text two and the questionnaires, a break, and part three, the TIQ, the retrospective commentaries, and a post-task interview. So you can see that they started off with text one, for either in the ELF or edited version. So if they started off with text one in the ELF version, they would get text two in the edited version, or vice versa, in a randomized fashion, so that each participant had to go through two texts, and one ELF and one edited version. Our participants were 28 professional interpreters and 24 master students, all of which had German as their first language and English as a B or C language. And the stimuli we used were a technical and a general speech, or were the two texts that I mentioned, the two speeches. One was of a more general, one of a more technical nature, mobility as a topic or economic demand. So this is interpreting only. I'm not going into the translation task and results. The speech length was very similar, delivery speed also, and as I said, there were those two versions, ELF and edited, of both texts. And this brings me to the results. Yeah, everybody, as we know, is interested in the hard sciences, so I thought I'd let the cat out of the bag right from the beginning. I'm sure you want to know what happened at the neuropsychology lab in the EEG setting. And as you can see here, there was, maybe I should just quickly mention, what they did was we gave them the input, the same kind of authentic material from the conferences where we collected our source input. And for the spoken language task, it was divided up into 3 parts of 6 minutes each. And then the first part was listening, the second part was shadowing, the third part was interpreting. And after each subtask, they had to rate the perceived difficulty of the task on a Likert scale. And what the EEG showed by means of the theta power marker, which is on the basis of EEG research is meant to be a marker of cognitive load, is first of all, there's an increase in workload in simultaneous interpreting compared with listening and shadowing. This is an expected result, of course. However, there was no significant increase in theta power for the professionals. This also is not new, because we know from studies like from Alexei R.W. Adelman and others, training seems to reduce experienced workload. So there was no increase in physiological workload marker here. So training seems to really decrease the brain activity, seems to, perhaps because of automatization, etc. Participants or professionals experience less load. Now, as for ELF, in the self-assessment, ELF texts were clearly associated with higher workload, especially in the listening task. However, this effect was not replicated in the EEG. We do wonder whether this is the full picture, because it might be, I mean, first of all, EEG is is associated or involves a lot of noise. So if the ELF effect is smaller than the noise, obviously you can't see it. Also, it might be that when looking at fatigue effects over time or at order effects, because those effects we found in our data, perhaps it would be possible to find an EEG ELF effect. But for the time being, in the setup chosen here, there was no ELF effect in the EEG. This is the publication in Brain and Language. If you are interested, it has only just come out. And it leaves us with the question, so is there no objective ELF effect on interpreters, only a self-reported subjective one? Or is brain activity only half the picture and the story? So this takes me to the results of our analyses in the simulated work lab. And I'll report to you three analyses, the results of three analyses. One is relevance theory based, one is an accuracy analysis, and one is ELF density. This is a novel concept which we developed and introduced, and which we find intriguing and revealing when it comes to understanding ELF challenges in source texts. So to start off with relevance theory. Relevance theory is all about bridging the gap between what is said and what is meant. You all know what is said is linguistically underdetermined. It is, you understand much more than what is being made explicit, and relevance theory explains how utterance understanding is done, or how this bridge is being, how this gap is being bridged. It is a general theory of cognition and communication. It takes a cognitive psychological perspective, and the core part is that the search for or the maximization of relevance is a basic feature of human cognition. So all our cognition is geared towards getting the maximum cognitive effects or informational gain at minimum processing effort. And the interesting part, this sentence is actually taken from the call of the relevance theory interpreting conference next year in Rome. And and Robin Seton, which Professor Liu just mentioned, he will actually be giving a keynote there, because he's one of the main researchers in relevance theory and interpreting. So this is a sentence from the call, and it says it's a theoretical framework of how humans understand the world, cognition, and how they convey thoughts and understand each other, communication. And this makes it particularly interesting for interpreting, because that means it covers both dimensions, the comprehension and the production dimension. On one hand, there is the inferential dimension. How does one understand utterances? By means of inference. And then there is the production dimension. How do people make ostensibly clear to a listener that what he is going to say is relevant enough, is worth their processing effort. So you have to make things explicit in a certain way to attract the attention of your listener. So it has both those dimensions, and this is ideal for interpreting, because in this way we can not only look at how the interpreter understands ELF input, but also at how the ELF speaker makes explicit input, and how the interpreter then chooses to make explicit whatever he or she has understood in order to bring it home to the target audience, in order to maximize relevance for them. Moreover, relevance theory offers a methodological toolkit, the so-called enrichment processes. So it gives us these enrichment processes to minutely analyze the complements that interpreters make in order to bridge this gap between what is made explicit and what they understand. So the enrichment processes show us how they flesh out the source propositions, and then how they enrich them for the target propositions. And the beautiful thing about interpreting is that whatever of these relevance theory-based processes is normally hidden in the black box, we can now see it because the target renditions give it away. They show us exactly what enrichments an interpreter has actually made. I'll give you an example to make this clearer. A says, how is Jane feeling at her first year at university? And B says, she didn't get enough units and can't continue. Now A will understand much more than those words in red, than the lexical items, because they will be sharing contextual knowledge, they will be sharing knowledge about the person. So on the basis of common ground, A will understand much more, and these are the blue bits. So the red bits are the parts that are being said and made explicit, and the blue bits are everything else that is being understood. And that is added mentally via those enrichment processes, reference assignments to come from she to Jane, meaning specification, etc. So A understands the full bit, what is the full expliciture, the fully fleshed out proposition of Jane didn't pass enough university units to qualify for admission to second year study. And as a result, Jane cannot continue with her university studies. So via decoding of the red bits that are made explicit and inferencing of those parts that were not made explicit, you get the full explicature and proposition. But understanding meaning is more than that. There is usually also implied meaning. This is the implicature, so you will also understand the premise and the conclusion. University failure affects state of mind, so Jane isn't feeling happy. All of this is inferred, all of this is understood. And what we then did is we used the enrichment types. The broad ones are reference assignment, disambiguation, and general enrichment, but there are also more detailed ones. And we then tagged the renditions, the interpreters' renditions. So on the left, you have in the left column, you have the source text. In the right column, you have the target speech. And you can see here that we have taggings in yellow for reference assignment, green for general enrichment, pinkish for specifications, orange for cohesion. Cohesion is an important category. And then also the neutralizations. The neutralizations are a subcategory which is not mentioned in the relevance theory literature by Sperber and Wilson, Carsten and Blakemore and others, but it is mentioned by Robin Seton. In his account of relevance theory and interpreting. And he says that disambiguation, which is a major enrichment category, can be divided. There are two types of disambiguation. The linguistic context disambiguates polysemy, and the cognitive context neutralizes the effect of deviations such as ungrammatical and infelicitous expressions, e.g. with non-native speakers. So you can see this is exactly what we are interested in, because in ELF input there will be so many deviations, ungrammatical and infelicitous expression. And here are the results of our 28 interpreters. These are the results only for the general mobility text, because we are still in the processing of analyzing the more technical one. So you have 14 interpreters for the ELF, from interpreting the ELF version, and 14 interpreting the edited version. And as you can see, the neutralizations are indeed the main interventions. There are many, many, many. and there are none in the edited version because, of course, they have been edited out because they are ELF-specific deviations which you would not find in an edited version. And the neutralizations are, of course, things that would often be compensated for by way of the linguistic competence of the interpreter. They might not even notice, they might do it automatically, for instance, when there is grammatical incongruencies or things like that. However, there are also a number of neutralizations, like we have seen in our data. The conditionals would have done things like that, which are used as an indirect speech rather than in the idiomatic sense. And these are things where in the Commons, the interpreters said that they often got confused and they didn't quite know, has this thing that they were describing actually happened or not. So you can see these can become real stumbling stones for the interpreters, and where maybe the interpreting flow is disrupted a little, or where they have to think twice, which means that this would add to a cognitive load. And then you have overall more completions from the ELF version, and even if you take away the neutralizations, which, as I said, not all of them need to be taken away, but that would need a qualitative analysis, then still you are left with quite a number of completions. For the disambiguations and specifications, it is different. There are less disambiguations and specifications from the ELF as compared to the edited version. And we assume that this is actually an indicator that from the ELF version, people were so busy with whatever deviations they got, so they did not have the resources to engage in disambiguation and specifications and just left it as vague as they got it, which an interpreter is always free to do. So it takes additional resources to engage in disambiguation and specification. Cohesion, which is a major interpretive quality marker, as you know, from Zwischenberger and others, they were also the interpreters also engaged in many more cohesion complements from the ELF than the edited version. And overall, we can say that the enrichments, the completions like reference assignment, elliptical gaps, general enrichments, cohesion, that are more relevant in the not relevance theory sense, but in a colloquial sense, they lead the interpreter to have to do more, to have to make more interventions and to intervene more. The preliminary conclusions are relevance theory allows us a completion by completion analysis of how exactly interpreters flesh out source input to recover speakers' intended meaning and enhance its relevance for target listeners. That seems to suggest that interpreters strive to optimize ELF input and to maximize relevance for the audience. The significantly higher number of enrichments found in renditions based on ELF versus edited text, especially from the technical text, which we are just in the process of analyzing. We've done the first for 8 interpreters. Show that there might be more effort involved, because the more you have to intervene, the more you have to engage in this complementing, completion activity, the more effort might involve. But obviously, this is not a one-to-one relation, and we have to triangulate this with other CLINT methods. And then this raises the question as to whether or not this additional or heightened activity optimizes the target version as compared to the source text. And here we might need in-depth quality ratings of the target text and perhaps comprehension tests. But if we look at the study of Karin Reithofer from the University of Vienna, her PhD study, she found that listeners to the interpreter of an ELF speaker had significantly higher comprehension scores than those listening to the original speaker. So this is a bit of an indicator that interpreters actually do optimize or improve on the source text. So art relevance theory is, as I believe, a useful instrument for demonstrating interpreters' actual intervention activity, and gives us at least preliminary cues as to potential effort and improvement involved. And perhaps it's an indicator of agency, because the more you become active with intervening or doing more, completing, the more you engage in agency, and the less you follow a kind of Kundui-like model. The manuscript is submitted, and this leaves us with the question as to whether there is more evidence of ELF effects. So there, from a relevance, using a relevance theory-based analysis, the ELF effects can be shown in terms of higher completion activity. And what about the accuracy analysis? Do we find more ELF effects there? And when we look at our 28 professional interpreters, we see that there is an ELF effect in the technical text, but not in the general one. The gray box plots are for edited, the blue ones for ELF. So when interpreting for the general text, there was no difference, at least no significant difference between the ELF and the edited version. However, in the technical, when interpreting the technical text, there was a clear evidence. As for the students, there was no such difference in either text, be it the general or the technical one. On one hand, we had the feeling that we were a little bit overwhelmed with both texts being students. And on the other hand, there was at least a near significant effect in the technical text. It came close to significance, but not quite. And this led Anne-Kathrin Gieshoff, our postdoc, to dig a little bit deeper. And what she did was she divided up the source text and the renditions into 5 episodes, phases, parts, whatever, and did the calculations for each episode. And there you can see that, again, for the professionals and the students, there is no ELF effect in either episode, as we said before, for the full text. However, when you look at the technical text, you can see, yes, for each episode, there is the significant ELF effect, which I have already mentioned. And now in the technical text for the students, you can see that there is indeed a significant effect for the last 2 episodes. So this near significant effect becomes a significant effect if you look at parts of the speech. So here you can see where it becomes, where the different starts showing. And this led Anne-Kathrin on to dig even deeper. I'm sorry, I just have to use my cable because to recharge, so that we don't run out of battery. Okay, so this led her on to dig even more deeper because she wanted to see what happens to accuracy over time, over the course of the interpretations, what differences could be shown. And here you can see beautifully, each line is a rendition, each line is an interpreter. The gray lines are renditions from the edited version, and the blue lines are renditions from the ELF version. And on the one hand, you can see that accuracy goes down towards, in the course of the renditions, towards the end of the speech. You can also see that it goes further down with the students than with the professionals. And what you can see is that for the professionals in the technical text, you can see very nicely that the blue lines are further down than the gray lines. So you can here beautifully see the significant ELF effect for the professionals in the for the technical text. There is, this has been published in Perspectives. It's a pre-runner publication in the sense that at the time of the publication, the ELF analyses were not done yet, so we didn't have the results. So this only looks at the renditions of the edited versions and is meant to introduce this refined approach to interpreting performance analysis or to accuracy analysis. And obviously, there will be a follow-up publication looking at both the renditions from the ELF and the edited versions. So I think we can say we do find ELF effects on performance by the either in the form of a heightened completion activity when we have the relevance theory based analysis, or in the form of loss in information when we look at the accuracy analysis, and especially so in the technical text and in particular phases and episodes of the source text. And this led us on, and this brings me to my last analysis or my last way of analyzing ELF, which I want to present to you. This led us on to ask, so where does ELF become particularly poignant? Where are we really, are we finding ELF particularly challenging? We have introduced a new concept, that of ELF density, which is meant to capture clusters of ELF features. Because in our data, we observed that ELF phenomena were rather unevenly distributed across the speeches. So you would find almost dative-like stretches, and they were followed by odd ones, where ELF phenomena seemed to cluster at various points. So our assumption was perhaps interpreters can compensate a single phenomena pretty easily by means of their linguistic competence, their coherence building capabilities, their background knowledge, etc. But maybe when it starts accumulating, it might get more challenging. And we saw in the literature that indeed there is the notion of odd structures. Kestjes and Kirner-Ludwig have defined an odd structure in ELF data. If it as a structure that violates the structural dimension, i.e., saliently and conventionally expected sequences. So that would be the case. That would be the case with approximations, which I mentioned earlier on, or puts forward contradictory information and breaks the topical or situational frame of a convention. So for again, dialogical ELF data, odd structures have been observed, have been researched, and have been defined. But as I said, it was for dialogical data, and it was for single bits in the data. We wanted to see what if it gets compounded. So we defined ELF dense spots as locations in text and speeches where ELF-specific more and less odd features and structures manifest in an accumulated manner. And in order to be able to see where this happens in source speeches, we first of all had, of course, to identify the individual features in order to see where they accumulate, where they are concentrated, where they cluster together. And for this, we chose a deductive approach. We looked in the literature, especially Mauranen 2012, who describes typical ELF features and phenomena, and then Andres 2015, who describes the text difficulties for interpreting, and then various results from the ITELF research, things mentioned by interpreters in self-report studies. And we came up with 6 categories under which we felt that individual ELF features and phenomena fall, such as processing, lexis, grammar, explicitness, cohesion, and argumentation. And we then did another MaxQDA tagging, this time not of the renditions, but of the source text, in order to see, so we tagged the source text for those ELF features. To see where it gets dense, where they come together. And then we found that with MaxQDA, once it gets particularly dense and you have several features in one spot, the colors would start to blur and would become gray, or yellow and blue would become green, things like that. So we felt we needed a different way of visualizing dense spots. And this has turned out to be the best one to visualize dense spots. So it's a bar chart which gives you the text, the sentence, so you can see each and every word, which is important for the analysis. The colors give away the individual category or feature that is involved. And here you can not only see that you have quite a number of features and phenomena in one sentence, but by layering, you can also see where different features accumulate in one particular word, where there are 2 or 3 layers even. And after this, we felt, okay, this is the way of conceptualizing, of describing dense spots. But now, is there an empirical foundation to it? In order to look into that, we looked at our post-task interviews. 2 of the questions in those interviews were, was there anything that disturbed you or disrupted your target speech delivery flow while interpreting the source speech? And the other one, can you remember any actual interpreting difficulties you were faced with while interpreting the source speech? And indeed, many of the disrupting features or difficulties that were mentioned fell under our our categories. So there seemed to be some psychological plausibility to this idea of the dense spots, and for an even better empirical foundation, we then went on to look at the retrospective commentaries, because the retrospective commentaries, as I said when I explained the study design, the setup, after the second task, interpreters or participants were asked to retrospectively comment on what they did, and for that was prompted. So they were played the source text again, and they could just freely comment whatever came into their mind in terms of, what they felt was tricky, or where they felt, oh, this was, so they just freely commented on hearing the source text again. And then we aggregated the comments across ELF density, and ELF density is defined as number of of ELF features. So with each feature in a sentence, another layer would be added, and it would be more dense. And then there was it was statistically calculated, and you can see here a moderate to weak correlation between comments made, retrospective comments, and ELF density. So there is again some foundation to this concept, because apparently the features, the ELF features which we defined in the source and tagged in the source text, those difficulties or ELF features were mentioned as difficulties by the interpreters. So this is this dense spot or ELF density concept and visualization and how you can work with it, etc., is published in Applied Linguistics. It's just about to be released. And as I said, we think we have some reason to believe that there is some psychological plausibility and empirical foundation to ELF dense spots. And the obvious next step will be to look at the renditions of the ELF dense spots. So this is an ongoing master thesis. So we take the ELF dense spots and then we look at the impact on the rendition. So our working hypothesis would be that there's a difference between the renditions of the ELF spots as opposed to the renditions of the corresponding edited sentences. And this brings me to my final remarks. We see some benefits in a relevance theoretic enrichment analysis because it shows us what interpreters actually do and gives us clues as to whether interpreters improve on the source text. The accuracy analysis shows performance and fatigue effects over time and points to particularly problematic text phases and episodes. And the density analysis enables us to describe ELF source text and to see where ELF is concentrated and to explore those particular spots with a view to effects on the target renditions. And this can help for source speech selection, for training, for instance. You can see what are particularly ELF-specific texts. And it also helps to identify ELF-specific dense spots in materials which you can then use for focused ELF-edited comparisons, because you will not always have the time and the resources to look at the full speeches, so you can look at those particular parts of the speech. So preliminary conclusions, yes, there are ELF effects, but not in the EEG. But in the self-reports and in the performance analysis, in the relevance theory-based performance analysis, this translates into increased completion activity. In the accuracy analysis, it translates into information loss. It also showed in an approximation analysis. This was another master thesis, where a corpus linguistic analysis was done, and it was found that the collocations, the original collocations, the more frequent a collocation was in the British national corpus, the more the ELF disadvantage and the edited advantage showed. So the more frequent a collocation, the more you could see that the edited version led to a better or more accurate rendition of the approximations in the source. There's still to be done. Still under investigation are looking at the renditions of the dense spots, as I said, and then looking at the disfluencies using a part analysis. Looking at our eye tracking data, we do not look at pupil dilation because our participants used glossaries. So a lot of the time they do not look at the screen. So what we want to look at is time away from screen, and we have the webcam recording, so we can have a look at what do they do when they do not look at the screen, and how long do they not look at the screen? Is there any difference between ELF and edited again? Then a face reader analysis on the dense spots. The idea being that perhaps if you are confronted with a dense spot as an interpreter, it will start showing in your face. You will have some emotional reaction. You will maybe look, it will show annoyance, or you will be tense or whatever. So maybe we can see something there comparing ELF and edited. Then heart rate for stress. We used the Apple Watch and want to look at that data. And then finally look at the results of the survey in more detail, where we asked all kinds of questions, especially regarding difficulties related to ELF input and the strategies interpreters and translators use in dealing with them. And then it will be compared between translators and translators and non-T&I multilinguals also, and see what their results are. So the concluding tendency is predictors of interpreter performance are first and foremost expertise. Then it would be text technicality, and then also ELF to a smaller degree. So in technical texts, you would find an ELF effect. You would find a difference between when rendering an ELF and an EDE version, which could perhaps also indicate that conference organizers might want to contract interpreters, especially for technical events, which actually they do more than for general events. So they intuitively do something which we can here show via this kind of research. If you want to know more about the project, there is an article in Translation, Cognition and Behavior, which covers the full project, also the neuropsychology part. And then there's an article in the Journal of English as a Lingua Franca, which covers the part of the simulated workplace setting for the interpreters and translators at our university. Those earlier publications from 2020, they do not yet include results. They are about the concept behind our studies, about data collection for this particular setting, about how you have to prepare the stimuli, about the methods used, etc., etc. And this takes me to thanking you for keeping up with the very long talk. And if you can still master the concentration, I'm very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for giving us such a comprehensive structure and systematic overview of English as a lingua franca. And also so interestingly, the results of your study. And then just to show that, how two parts of the study from three groups of researchers using different approaches, different methodology come so nicely together. I have tons of questions, and I was completely engrossed in your talk. But we're going to ask our audience, if you have questions, you can either turn on your mic, preferably turn on your camera too, or you can also choose to type in your questions in the chat box. Michaela, I'm reading a question. in addition to a lot of thank you notes to you and showing appreciation of your talk.
Thank you so much, and sorry, but I had just to give my throat a little bit of to water a little bit.
No, that's fine. Yeah, I'm glad you have water.
Should I check what is in the chat, or how does it work?
Can you see the questions in the chat box? I can read it out to you.
If you can, that would be great.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. I have 3 questions. First, could the people from China, which is in the expanding circle, who can they speak perfect English, which is with no accent at all, and as good as the people from the inner circle? So this is question number 1. Probably, Michaela, if you want to answer the first question.
So the question is whether it is possible for people from the expanding circle to speak perfect English.
That's right.
I believe, I mean, we know from bilingualism studies that obviously there are a number of kind of windows of learning a foreign language. So for accent, it becomes more and more difficult. Like, you know, I will never get a native speaking English. I started learning too late. In terms of accent, it will just not happen. As for grammar and lexical expressions, you can theoretically, but it will be difficult unless, I mean, you really make a big effort or you are immersed in an English situation, like going abroad for a couple of years, something like that. So I think it is possible, but it's an uphill task. Yeah. And there is also the factor of attrition. Like, you know, years back when I did interpreting, or when I spent a year in England, my English was much more fluent. Now it's written English is fine, but spoken English, you just don't have the practice. So you get a little bit, to keep up a language is just an uphill task, which you always have to engage in. It is possible, but I think you can generally, as an interpreter, when you go to a conference, it's good if you try to get information about your audience. And you can assume that if you get people from the expanding circle, like Chinese people, then you can imagine that they would probably have not mostly not a native language. In Hong Kong, the situation is different because you have kind of imbibed it from early on. Yeah, Hong Kong would be outer circle English speakers.
The second part of the question and the third question actually are related. So I'm going to just read them out to you together. The second question is it necessary that interpreters have the ability to speak perfect English? So this one. And the other one is it acceptable for interpreters to speak English with an accent?
The third one, I would say absolutely yes, because unless you are in an institution like the EU or the UN, where you always interpret into your mother tongue, then the question does not arise. But if you are on the private market in Germany, in Switzerland, in many, many countries, you do retour interpreting. So you will have to interpret into your B language. You cannot expect every person to have an absolute perfect English accent. That is not possible. And it's my observation when I was studying conference interpreting, I always observed that there were interpreters who were, like in Switzerland, we have so many people and they are fully bilingual. They are balanced bilinguals. They grow up with 2 languages from childhood on. In Germany, we don't have that. We are a really expanding circle country. So people learn English at a later stage. And I could see that people who are fully bilingual were not necessarily better as those who you know, who were not fully bilingual, but who learned their B language. And they just had the transfer processes worked out beautifully. They had analytical skills, the multitasking, everything that is involved in interpreting is so much more than 2 languages. So they were even sometimes better in interpreting than the full bilinguals. And nobody worried about if the accent was perfect or not. And you can't worry about it because on the market, you won't get, you won't have enough interpreters who have a perfect accent. So I wouldn't think that this is something to be worried about. Again, to speak perfect English, as an interpreter, your command of the foreign language, of the B language, if it's a B language, not if it's a C language, but if it's a B language, has to be very, very high. But that again depends on the market, on the country, etc. The standards are pitched very high, so try to go as far as you can, but I wouldn't say it has to be perfect. Maybe some people would disagree, but this would be my way of looking at it.
Thank you. Not seeing any. Okay, let me see. Okay, thank you. Not seeing any more questions. Michaela, if I may, I have a lot of questions. And first of all, I'm very, very interested in knowing, for example, particularly in the part of the study, you know, where you dug deeper into your data when you compare the general text and there's also the technical text. You were telling us that OC structures and some probably single words, problematic single words. So those are at the lexical level. I just don't know whether you know, when we compared, when we wanted to find out what the true nature of English as a lingua franca, people who are not speaking English as a native language, you know, whether it's in their use of a syntactic structure or their lexical choices, because I'm also referring to the visualization slide you show us, because if I saw it correctly, I saw that the colors that show grammar and the color that showed the lexical related aspects of your data, compared with cohesion, for example, they seem to not to be of a lesser portion, smaller portion, compared with cohesion. So I just don't know whether, you know, when it comes to lexical choices or syntactic choices, you know, which can be a bigger problem, you know, when it comes to English as a lingua franca. And this is also related to what you just said about talking about interpreters, you know, who may not be true bilinguals, but, you know, they learned their second language, not as a native language, but they can become they maybe be a better interpreter. So I just don't know whether there's some aspects to which, you know, these characteristics of their languages that may contribute to difficulties in understanding people who use English as a second language or as a foreign language.
I mean, the tagging only shows the deviations, the irregularities which we find, but that doesn't mean that these irregularities are a challenge or not. Okay, so the fact that there are so many more perhaps grammatical deviations is just due to the fact that perhaps the ELF speaker the ELF speaker's proficiency level is not up to you know, is not up to a certain standard. But it doesn't mean that this becomes a difficulty for the interpreter. And in fact, we have found that grammatical, that is mostly self-report, if I remember correctly. But also in the ELF literature, there's something to that effect, which says that grammatical deviations, or let's say irregularities, are more easily compensated for than lexical ones. Oh, there is in fact one, there was a translation-based studies where we got text from the European Parliament, which were analyzed. And this also showed that the what led mostly to translation problems, that was not interpretive, but translation problems, were lexical unorthodoxies, not the grammatical ones. So grammatical ones would be more easily compensated for, and what is really tricky is the logic argumentation part. And that would be a case of cohesion also. And if you remember, I mean, in consecutive, what do you have, you know, the margin for? What do you make an effort for to note down your conjunctions and your cohesive ties? Because this is so essential for the overall structure and for the overall intention of the message. So I would say that cohesion and lexical features are more prone to inducing interpreting problems than grammar ones. There is a couple of small pieces of evidence to that effect. And in our accuracy analysis, we have actually made an effort to weigh the different accuracy, the different accuracy problems, you know, because we felt if like a cohesion bit of information falls apart, this is more problematic for the source text, for the listener, than if it's say another piece of information. So there are differences on the one hand in what you get as input, but also in how you render it.
It's interesting. I wonder, you know, talking about the syntactic part, I wonder whether the fact that compared with the lexical related issues, it is not as difficult is because people who use English as a foreign language may use simpler sentence structures to begin with. And I don't know whether that may contribute to the syntactic aspects of it being a lesser problem for them, for interpreters.
I think there are many factors. On one hand, the grammatical structures can be simpler, the lexical parts can be simpler. Also, some ELF speakers tend to be, or non-native speakers tend to be slower than native speakers. So there are a number of factors which can actually be conducive to interpreting, and others are not. And it depends perhaps on the situation, you know, I mean, depending on the context, on the topic, on so many factors, because the interpreting is so multifaceted. On the other hand, I think it depends also on the combination of the features. This is our impression, you know, single irregularities, single deviations, single problems, challenges can be compensated for by the interpreter, by their background knowledge, inference capacities, etc. But when it comes together, accent plus irregularities on different levels, etc., then it can become tricky. And what the individual constellation is, yeah, you will, or to the extent to which it really presents a challenge, has to be seen in the situation. I think it's very difficult to give a general statement on this.
Very interesting, thank you. I see a participant who asked to be unmuted, and so probably we can unmute her or him because I cannot really see your name here. Yeah, please unmute yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's me, Yavuz. Sorry, it is my school ID, and I'm joining your lovely and very, very, very important course, seminar from Turkey. I'm based in the Central Anatolia. My question is, I'm normally a language student at English Language and Literature Department. This is my second major. After many years later, I decided to, get into the language very deeply. So as a language student, sometimes I think whether it is necessary or not necessary to study language and literature instead of studying majoring in translation and interpretation. Do you think it is possible for me if I keep studying in this field, and while I'm at school, I can improve my, interpreting skills by maybe taking some private courses, online courses. There are many different courses on which I've been looking for, and which is searching, of course, from the UK especially. And my second question is the accent. As a late bloomer, it's so difficult. I wasn't born into a native, English speakers. So among these people, I never lived and never been to the UK. I would like to go to the UK instead of other English-speaking countries. How can I do that? How can I improve these? And the third one is, how can I integrate my linguistic skill with job? When it comes to finding a job, how can I use my linguistic skill? These are my major and main questions. Thank you.
I think the first question is actually a good question for Professor Liu, because to whether or not it takes a university degree to do interpreting, or whether or not bilinguals can do it. You have beautifully explained this, Minhua, in the languages between minds session. So maybe you want to say something on that. And accent-wise, it's my impression is it has to do with your hearing capabilities. For instance, if you have a talent for music. I mean, I have this in my family. Okay, my daughter, she has the hearing capacities, the musical ear, as we can say, from her father, and I don't have that. So I always find it difficult to really get the accent completely in tune with the native speaking accent. She finds it very easy. She studied in England, she comes back and everybody says to her, well, you are your native speaker. So for me, this is my impression, is the musical ear which helps. Other than that, obviously, if you listen a lot to native speaking input and then also not only listen, but try to produce and come as close as possible as it is, if that is something you want to achieve. As I said, I don't think, especially, I mean, ELF researchers would say nowadays, the accent is not something that you need to get right. This is global English, and global English means that everybody has their own background and everybody has their own accent, and you have to be able to make yourself understood and to get communication going on a level where you want to be communicating. It's not an issue of accent anymore. It's a bit different for the interpreters who are professionals, language professionals and experts. So they have a somewhat different standard. Yeah, so it might be a bit different. And your third question, as for applying languages, I mean, obviously there is a difference between studying languages at a pure science university or at applied science university. So in applied science universities, you would actually end up in an institute of translation and interpreting and study and learn the task at hand. Bringing the languages as you do is fine, is good, is a wonderful basis. If it's enough to, I mean, I'm sorry, but I don't think I can answer this question because it depends on, your country, your markets, your whatever. I don't know to what extent you can just use your linguistic knowledge and apply it. I mean, for conference interpreting, you would definitely need a university degree most of the time. If you do community interpreting, public service interpreting, it's different. So in Turkey, for instance, depending on the languages you have available, you might be able to do public service interpreting on that basis. It depends a little bit on what you want to do, but I can't in general tell you what possibilities you have in your country with also depending on your language pairs. But Minhua, perhaps you want to add to this.
Oh, well, thank you, Michaela, for putting me on the spot. Well, risking offending colleagues who are trainers, who are interpreters, or even offending student trainees who are taking interpreting courses. But I truly believe that if you have very good languages, you don't really need a lot of training in interpreting. But you do need to understand the mechanism behind, for example, particularly simultaneous interpreting. And that does not mean that people with good languages do not need any training, because sometimes that awareness is just not there. And I think training for these people is for that purpose. And a lot of times it takes a lot of practice for you to develop that kind of awareness. It's not just, you listen to your professors talk about how simultaneous interpreting works. If the professor can actually, clearly depicts the process of interpreting. It doesn't just take that. It takes actually doing it, to understand the mechanism of interpreting. But beyond that, if you're aware of that, and if you have very good languages, I really think sometimes it doesn't really take a lot of training for people who have great languages to become good interpreters. Yeah,
it's more a question of what the market requires. For certain jobs, they want a certificate. I think that it's more that kind of issue. It's not that you can't do it. There are ways of getting there without studying it, but the question is whether a certificate is required in certain jobs.
Exactly. Yes. I'm looking at the time right now, but I do see a couple of questions, and let me read out one of them. We probably will only have time to allow these two questions here. The first question is by raised by Dr. Damien Fan. Do you think there would be a difference in the quality of output between interpreters who speak the ERF speaker's native tongue and those who do not? For example, the Chinese booth interpreting a Chinese ELF speaker versus the Spanish booth interpreting the same speaker. Is it methodologically meaningful or rigorous to compare the quality of the Chinese and Spanish renditions? It's a very dense question. So Michaela, did you get what I just read out?
We definitely have a lot of self-report and a little bit of performance-based evidence that the shared languages, as I've called it, helps tremendously. So if you know the L1 of the ELF speaker, it does help you to be much quicker and to make your comprehension process easier. And that obviously helps in your production. So I would suggest that yes, unless your Spanish booth colleagues, they know Chinese. I mean, they might not be, that might be one of their languages anyways, even though they translate from Spanish into English or whatever. But if they have Chinese, then the advantage is there for them. The benefit is there for them too. We are in the process of looking at that because we have the language and biographical data of our participants. So this is something we want to actually also look at, whether people who have this kind of background, who have the L1 of the speaker who delivered our input, whether their output is better. Obviously, we do it between the ELF and edited version, so this is a more rigorous way of looking at it. Comparing, but it's still the same speech. I mean, if you have, if you have an English speech, which is then translated into Spanish in the Spanish booth, into Chinese in the Chinese booth, yeah, it's difficult to compare that, isn't it? It's very difficult. In our case, it's more straightforward. I'm not sure whether this can be done so easily. I think you could start with interviewing the people and asking them to what extent it helped that they knew the first language of the speaker, and perhaps also look at various structures where like you can replay the source speech to them and then asked them which of the input structures they could really recognize on the basis of their knowing Chinese, for instance. So I would perhaps approach it in that way, but a direct comparison between a Spanish and a Chinese rendition is a bit tricky.
Well, that's a very, very good way that you suggested to investigate this, Michaela. Michaela, I mean, I see two more questions. Is it okay that we answer? Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Yes, yes, I'm happy to.
The first one, let me see. Okay. What discipline do you think should be introduced into students' curriculum to train interpreters better?
I mean, what discipline? I mean, since we're speaking of ELF, we have specialized ELF classes, and our students say that they feel it's great support for them. You know, they really feel it has an added advantage for their work, because it depends on the market, but in the markets we train our students for, the English speakers are more and more non-native speakers. So being prepared for this particular situation, having this kind of background, which I mentioned, helps them a lot. And I would definitely say, normally in interpreter training, you get the odd TED talk, you know, you get an ELF speech here and there, which you interpret like any other speech which you get to interpret during your training. But perhaps if you do it in a more systemized manner, like we do it over 2 semesters, and really with a concept behind it, and also dealing with ELF input from different regions, like, you know, we have a session on European English, on Asian English, on African English, etc. That does help a lot. So yeah, depending on the countries, but in most countries, depending on the markets, I would say introducing ELF classes is probably helpful for the student.
Well, thank you so much. You answered one of my questions. One of the questions I noted down, you know, when I was listening to you about the training that is so unique, you know, that you're offering in your program. The second question, the last question, is about machine interpreting. Machine interpreters like Meta's speech-to-speech translator or professional human interpreters, which group interprets, say, a 15-minute English as a lingua franca speech, which interpreter can perform better? Who would you bet? And do you think it's research worthy?
We actually had a bachelor thesis which was looking into that, because our hypothesis was that you know, that the machine translation tools are kind of or were not anymore, but were kind of trained for native language, because they got all the native language English input. So we thought they might be running into real trouble when they get ELF input. And then what they did was, obviously you can't compare it with humans, but you can have a look as to what comes out in the target text, you know, and what problems ELF features in the source text can produce in the target text. That you can look at. And they did it, and it's, I'm sorry, it's years back, and I can't remember the result. I can't tell you, but it was an interesting little piece of work. And what we do is that our translation department is very much, has a focus, has a main research area in the in human versus machine translation, and they look very closely into the benefits. And I myself, I'm interested in, as I told you, Minhua, in the intuition, you know, in the part of things. What is it that humans can add, or what is it that they can bring in, and that makes them shine and stand out against the machine? I think there is a lot in terms of intuition, creativity, etc. But I haven't had time yet to look at that and at the moment it's the translation people at our department who are looking into that. And my bet, I mean, as you know, with the new translation, machine translation systems. They are pretty fantastic. It's scary. So at our department, the approach is not to let it scare you, but to teach people how to really deal with machine translation in a beneficial way. To what to look out for, where are the pitfalls, how to deal with them, also about data security and all kinds of things. So yeah, there's a lot of research out there, and I wouldn't dare to make a bet.
Thank you so much for ending this, with a hopeful, very hopeful.
There's one more hand up.
Message.
Jonathan Ross, is that?
Hi, yeah.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Okay, thanks so much for taking my question. I really appreciate it. I mean, congratulations, wonderful research, really fascinating, and an example to all of us. So I understand, so you looked at these 3 different groups of undergraduate students and MA students and professional interpreters, which, makes a lot of sense. But I wonder if you did any kind of differentiation within the group of professional interpreters, for example, to look at the to control for like the amount of previous exposure to ELF among the interpreters. I mean, that would probably have been pretty difficult to do, but they could have kind of self-reported on that. It would complicate things enormously, I suppose, but I wonder if you looked at that.
You got me there. Yeah, you got me there, because exposure is really a massively important factor. In this new article of Karin Reithofer, where she looked at her PhD data again and looked at whether what exposure did to coming to grips with ELF input, she found that exposure did more to it than domain knowledge of the topic that was at hand, and more than very high English levels of very high proficiency level in English. Exposure was the #1 factor that made a difference. And we heard about this when we were just about to wind up our survey. And I mean, this is really something that I find very difficult, because I asked for one question relating to exposure to be put in the last minute, and there was still time. They were rounding it up, and it somehow didn't get in. And it kind of, I mean, these are the things that happen in research. So we don't have this particular question in, but we have a number of questions which we can bring together to get an idea of exposure, but that is in the survey. So again, that is self-report. As for the actual test runs, we have a lot of biographical data of the participants, and we are actually in the process of figuring out how we can control for that, how we can look at various or take out various variables and see to what extent experience, something like that, but it has to be experience with ELF speakers, not just with interpreting. So we are trying to figure out whether we can look at particular groups of professionals and see whether there are any differences. And maybe I'll have something to tell at a later stage, but for the time being, this is all I can say. This is a very, very big factor which has to be reckoned with and taken into account.
Okay, thanks very much.
Oh, thank you very much for the good question and also for the answer. I think we probably only have time. We have to end here. It's already past 9 o'clock here. And then thank you so much, Michaela, and for this fascinating talk. I mean, I have learned so much from your talk. I'm sure I'm not alone here. And let me see. I think there just messages about showing of their appreciation, for you and for your talk. And here, just a very quick word of reminder, our participants, if you're interested in getting more information about the activities organized by the Center for Translation, you can write to us at ctn@hkbu.edu@hk, so that you can be put in our mailing list. And we're going to leave probably the end of the talk in about 10 seconds, so that I know that sometimes participants want to write some messages for the speaker. But thank you so much again, Michaela. It is just wonderful.
Thank you, Minhua, for the opportunity. It was a great pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, we're talking about 2 hours probably being a long enough time, but no, after listening to your talk, absolutely not. So look forward to the next episode of your of your research, borrowing your own term. So we look forward to inviting you back again to talk about
Thank you so much,
more findings. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye, everybody. Thank you.